In the labor market, demand refers to the quantity of labor that employers are willing to hire at a given wage rate, while supply represents the quantity of labor that workers are willing to offer at the same wage rate. When these two forces intersect, they determine the equilibrium wage rate and the employment level in the labor market. If the wage offered by the employer is too low, the quantity of labor demand may exceed the quantity of labor supplied. As a result, you will have excess demand. On the other hand, if the wage offered is too high, there may be a surplus of labor which leads to excess supply and potential layoff. Labor market equilibrium occurs when the quantity of labor demanded equals the quantity of labor supplied. As a result, you will have a stable employment level and a stable wage rate that balances the interest of both employers and workers in the labor market. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the basics of demand, supply and labor market equilibrium. Generally, farms combine various factors of production, mainly capital and labor, in order to produce goods and services that are sold in a product market. Their output and the way in which they combine labor and capital depends on three forces. One is the product demand. Second, the amount of labor and capital they can acquire at a given prices, and the choice of technology available to them. So, when we study the demand for labor, we are interested in finding out how the number of workers employed by a farm or a set of farms is affected by changes in one or more of these three forces. So, to simplify the discussion, we shall study one change at a time while holding the other forces constant. So, when we are talking about that, we will discuss about the demand for labor with the changes to the wages. We will keep constant the product demand in the product market. We will also assume that the price of capital is constant and the available technology is constant. Then, keeping one thing constant and the other two factors keep changing, we will discuss how the demand for labor is affected in the labor market. Here, we have taken a hypothetical industry data on wage rate and desired employment level. As you can see, as the wage rate increases, the desired employment level declines. If you plot these data, you will find that the demand for labor is downward sloping, which means as the wage rates decline, you can see the number of workers, the demand for number of workers increases and vice versa. If there is increase in wages, the demand for workers decline. So, we are having an inverse relationship between the demand of labor and the wage rate of a particular industry. So, how does the number of employees or the total labor hours demanded vary when wages changes? Suppose, for example, we could vary the wages facing a certain industry over a long period of time, but keep the technology available, the conditions under which the capital is supplied and the relationship between product prices and the product demand remain unchanged. What would happen to the quantity of labor demanded if wage rates were increased? So, when wage rates increase, keeping these factors constant, the two effects work together. One is the scale effect, another one is the substitution effect. Let us discuss these two effects in detail. First, the scale effect. Higher the wages imply higher costs, and usually it leads to higher product prices, because consumers respond to higher prices by buying less, and employer would tend to reduce their level of output and employment, other things being constant. So, this decline in employment is called the scale effect, the effect on desired employment of a small scale of the production. So, this is what is called the scale effect. Second, as wages increase, assuming the price of capital does not change at least initially, employers have the incentive to cut costs by adopting technology that relies more on capital and less on labor. So, the desired employment would fall because of a shift towards a more capital intensive mode of production. So, this effect is termed as the substitution effect, because the wage rises, the capital is substituted for labor in the process of production. So, higher wage, higher cost leads to higher price in the product market, leads to low product demand, which leads to low production, which leads to less demand for labor, is the scale effect. Whereas, higher wage leads to increase in the cost of labor, leads to induce the farm to substitute it by capital, assuming the price of capital constant, which leads to less demand for labor, is the substitution effect. So, these two effects work together, which leads to having a downward sloping of the demand curve, or an inverse relationship between these two variables, demand for labor and wages. Let us try to understand what happens to the labor demand when one of the other forces other than wage rate changes, like the demand for product in the product market. So, when changes in the demand for product in the product market happens, let us say there is an increase in the demand for the goods and services in the product market, then the output level would clearly rise as the farm in the industry sought to maximize their profit, and this will lead to a scale effect to produce more, which would increase the demand for labor at any given wage rate. As long as the relative prices of capital and labor remain unchanged, there will be no substitution effect. So, this will lead to a kind of shift in the demand function. Suppose demand for product of a particular industry were to increase, so that at any output price more of the goods and services could be sold. And in this case, technology and the conditions under which capital and labor are made available to the industry do not change. Output levels would clearly rise as the farm in the industry sought to maximize profit, as I said, and this scale effect would increase the demand for labor at given wage rate. Since the technology available and the condition under which the capital and labor are supplied have remained unchanged, this change in the product demand would increase the demand desired at any wage level that might prevail. In other words, we can say the entire labor demand curve shifts to the right, and this rightward shift, shown as the movement from D to D dash in the figure, indicates that at every possible wage rate, the number of workers demanded has increased. Now, let us try to understand what happens to the labor demand when there is a change in the supply of capital. Consider what would happen if the product demand schedule, the technology and the supply conditions, labor supply conditions were to remain unchanged, but the supply of capital changed, so that the capital price fell to 50% of their prior level. How would this change affect the demand for labor? So, this when the supply of capital, the cost of supply of capital declines, two effects can work together, both the scale effect as well as the substitution effect. Sometimes it may happen that the scale effect dominates the substitution effect. In that case, the demand for labor will shift towards right. Sometimes it may happen that the substitution effect may dominate the scale effect. In that case, the demand for labor will shift to the left. Let us discuss in detail how this substitution effect and scale effects dominates in different cases, and how this leftward and rightward shift will happen. First, when capital price decline, the cost of producing tends to decline, and the reduced cost stimulates the increase in the production, and these increases tends to raise the level of desired employment at any given wage rate. So, the scale effect of a fall in the capital price will tend to increase the demand for labor at each wage level. Therefore, the demand for labor tends to shift to the right. Second, a fall in the capital price would be a substitution effect, where farms adopt more capital intensive technologies in response to the cheaper capital. Such farms would substitute capital for labor and would use the less labor to produce a given amount of output than before. With less labor being desired at each wage rate and the output level, the labor demand curve tends to shift to the left. So, a fall in the capital price generates two opposite effects on demand for labor. One is the scale effect, another one is the substitution effect. The scale effect will push the labor demand curve towards right, while the substitution effect will push it to the left. As you can see from the figure, either effects could dominate. So, if substitution effect dominates over the scale effect, the labor demand curve will shift to the left, and if the scale effect dominates over the substitution effect, then the labor demand curve will shift to the right. However, economic theory does not have a clear-cut prediction about how a fall in the capital price will affect the demand for labor. Further, it is important to distinguish between a shift in the demand curve and movement along a demand curve. As you can see, labor demand curve is the function of labor desired as a function of the wage rate. When the wage changes and other forces held unchanged, one moves along the demand curve. So, when there is a change happens with the wage rate and the demand for labor, you are moving along the demand curve. However, when one of the other forces changes, like the demand for the product in the product market or the supply of capital in the factor market, there will be a shift in the demand curve. Unlike wages, these forces were not directly shown when we draw the demand curve for the labor. Therefore, when they change, a different relationship between wage and desired employment prevails, and this shows up a shift in the demand curve. We can integrate all these things together to understand the demand for labor you can see the farm interact with the consumer in the product market by selling certain goods and services. The outcome of this product market is the price and the product demand. The farm interact with the capital in the capital market. The outcome would be the supply of capital and the price of capital in the capital market. The farm interact with the labor in the labor market, which outcomes are the wage rate and the demand for labor. When keeping the price of capital constant, the product demand constant, the price of product constant, when we draw the relationship between wage and the demand for labor, we find this is having a downward sloping. So, we are moving along with the demand function. Now, when there is any changes happens to the product demand in the product market, the supply of capital in the capital market, keeping the wage rate constant, there happens a shift in the demand function. This shift can be left or towards right. So, the demand for labor in the labor market is a comprehensive study, how it relates with respect to the wage, how it relates with respect to the supply of capital, how it relates to the product demand in the product market. The demand for labor can be analyzed at various level, at market level, at industry and at a particular farm. And also the demand for labor can be analyzed in terms of long run demand function and short run demand function. It takes time for the employer to substitute capital for labor and vice versa, and the consumers may not change their product demand very much with response to their price changes. So, one can study with respect to the timeline short run demand function for versus the long run demand function. Having looked at a simple model of behavior on the buyers or the demand side of the labor market, we now turn to the seller or supply side of the labor market. For this purpose, in this discussion at this point of time, we shall assume that workers have already decided to work, and the question that they face is that what occupation and what employer to choose. So, the supply of labor to a particular market is positively related to the wage rate prevailing in that market, holding other wage rates constant. So, here we have taken the wages for the paralegals, the legal assistants. The occupation we have considered here is the paralegals, the legal assistants, and the industry of the paralegals. So, you can see as the wages for the paralegals increases, the supply of the number of paralegals enter into the labor market increases. So, the labor supply function is having a positive relationship between the number of workers and the wage rate. Let us consider the supply of labor to the entire market, not just to a particular farm as I said. In this case, we have considered the one of the markets, one of the occupations like the legal assistants or the paralegals. Let us try to understand how will supply respond to the changes in the wages of paralegals they might receive in this particular market. If the salaries and wages in other occupations are held constant and the wages of paralegals rise, we would expect to find more people wanting to become paralegals. For example, suppose that each of the 100 people in the college graduating class has the option of becoming an insurance agent or a paralegal. Some of these 100 people will prefer to be insurance agents, even if paralegals are better paid, because they like the challenges and the sociability of selling. However, some would want to be paralegals, even if the pay were comparatively poor, because they hate the pressure of selling. Moreover, many could see themselves doing either job. For them, the compensation in each occupation would be a major factor in their decision that whether to go for the occupation like paralegals or to go for the occupation of insurance agent. Therefore, the supply of labor to a particular market is positively related to the wage rate prevailing in that market, holding other wages constant, which means if the wages of the insurance agents are held constant and the paralegal wages rises, more people will want to become paralegals because of this relative improvement in the compensation. Therefore, we are having a positive relationship between this wage and the labor supply to this particular occupation called paralegals. Now, let us try to understand what are the factors that can affect the shift in the supply of these paralegals. As with demand curves, each supply curve is drawn holding the other prices and wages constant. If one or more of these other prices or wages were to change, then it could cause the supply to shift. As the salaries of the insurance agents rise, some people will change their mind about becoming paralegals and choose to become insurance agents. Therefore, increases in the salaries of insurance agents would cause the supply of paralegals to shift to the left. Now, let us try to understand what is going to happen to the supply of labor to a particular farm. There could be many farms in this paralegal industry. Let us try to understand what is going to happen to the supply of labor to a particular farm in that paralegal industry. There could be many farms, those who are hiring these paralegals. So, having decided to become a paralegal, an individual would then have to decide which offer of the employment to accept. If all employers were offering the paralegal jobs that were more or less alike, the choice would be based on entirely on compensation. It would be unwise for a farm to pay a wage below what others are paying. In that case, it could not attract any employees. On the contrary, no firm would be foolish enough to pay more than the going wage rate, because it would be paying more than it would have to pay to attract a suitable number of and quality of employees. Therefore, the supply curve to a firm then are horizontal, as you can see in this figure. It indicates that at the going wage rate, a firm would get all the paralegals it needs. If the paralegal wage paid by the others in the market is W0, then the firm's labor supply is S0. If wages falls to W1, then the firm's labor supply curve becomes S1. Now, you can see different slope for market supply curve and for the supply curve of a firm. The market supply curve is upward sloping, whereas the firm's supply curve is horizontal. So, the difference in slope between market supply curve and the supply curve to a firm is directly related to the type of choice facing the workers. In deciding whether to enter the paralegal labor market, workers must have both the compensation and the job requirements of alternative options such as insurance agent. If wages of these paralegals were to fall, not everyone would withdraw from the market, because the jobs of these insurance agents and paralegals are not perfectly substitute. Some people would remain paralegals even after a wage decline, because they dislike the job requirement of insurance agents. Once the decision to become a paralegal had been made, however, the choice of which employer to work for would be a choice among the alternatives, in which the job requirements were nearly same. Therefore, the choice would have to be made on the basis of compensation alone. If a firm were to lower its wages below those others offering, it would lose all its applicants. So, the horizontal supply curve is therefore a reflection of supply decision made among alternatives that are perfectly substitute to each other. For now, we will assume that individual firms like individual workers are wage taker, which means the wage they pay to their workers must be very close to the going wage rate if they face competition in the labor market. Neither individual workers nor the firms can set a price which is called wage for the labor much different from the going wage rate. In the next lecture, we will discuss the determination of wage through the simplest economic model of the labor market equilibrium. Thank you.